Hi, everyone. I'm very excited that we're kicking off day 2 of the partnership meeting with two global thought leaders who will reflect on how we can build back better at this very difficult time. One comes from the private sector and one from the public sector. I'm delighted to introduce Sunny Verghese, who's the co-founder and group CEO of Olam International. In addition, since 2018, Sunny has also been the chair of the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, which is the leading global CEO-led organization dedicated to accelerating the transition to a sustainable world. At Olam, Sunny is responsible for strategic planning, business development, and overall management of the Olam Group companies worldwide. Headquarters in Singapore, Olam currently ranks among the top 30 largest primary listed companies in Singapore in terms of market capitalization. In 2016, Fortune magazine recognized Olam as number 23 in its Change the World list. In 30 years, Sunny and his team have built this business to over $30 billion in sales revenues. Today, Olam operates in over 60 countries, delivering various agricultural raw materials and food ingredients across 18 different platforms to about 20,000 customers worldwide, and it employs about 75,000 people. Sunny holds a postgraduate management degree from the Indian Institute of Management, Ahmedabad, and has also completed the Advanced Management program from the Harvard Business School. We're really honored to have a global business leader and a global thought leader on sustainability with us today. So it's with great pleasure that I invite Sunny to speak. Over to you, Sunny. Sunny, I think you're on mute, so you need to unmute yourself first.
I'm sorry. Thank you very much, Rick, for that very generous introduction. As I was saying, I'm particularly delighted to be able to speak at this year's WCF 2020 partnership meeting, because I'm told that this is the only meeting this year anywhere in the globe that addresses the issue of cocoa sustainability. And I'm very clear in my mind that the central core issue and challenge that face all of us as stakeholders in the cocoa value chain is how do we pivot and transform the cocoa value chain to a more sustainable future. So it's extremely important and very close to my heart, and therefore I'm particularly pleased to be here and share some points of view with all of you. I want to organize my comments today into 4 quick parts. The first part, I want to talk about the COVID-19 pandemic and its implications. Second, I want to quickly provide a framework for what I see as a major global sustainability challenges. And then I want to hone in on the sustainability challenges in the cocoa sector. And then finally, a short call for action. So let me start with the first part, which is about the cocoa pandemic. I'm 61 years old, and this is the worst crisis that I have lived through. As of this morning, we have about 56.6 million COVID infections in about 204 countries and international conveyances. No country in the globe has been unaffected by this crisis. And very tragically, we have already lost 1.36 million lives as of this morning. We have Europe with almost 14.7 million cases. We have North America with about 13.9 million cases. We have Asia with about 15.3 million cases. We have South America, 10.5 million cases. And luckily for all of us, Africa has about 2 million infections, which in terms of the rate per million population is quite low. And because Africa has also got a very young population, they were spared from the worst ravages of this pandemic. So I want to address this pandemic in terms of these areas. First, of course, all of us know about the health pandemic. The issue is, statistically speaking, this is a bimodal problem, which means it has unknown probabilities with unbounded outcomes. And as we can see from the second surge, it looks like a very dark, bleak winter with some ray of hope and sunshine in terms of the vaccine news that we have heard of the effectiveness of the Pfizer vaccine and the Moderna vaccine and many other vaccine trials that are going around the world, So I think that's the only ray of good news. But I think we are still in the throes and the thick of this pandemic, and it will take us a while for us to see the light at the end of the tunnel. The second big impact of COVID has been that it has dramatically impacted the vulnerable sections of our society. So according to the World Bank, the number of poor or extremely poor people because of COVID in the baseline scenario has increased by 71 million people. And in the worst case scenario, or in the down case scenario, the number of poor people will go up by about 100 million this year on account of COVID, which means global poverty rates, which were at about 8.23%, will rise to about 9.13% at the end of this year. And all the gains that we have made in the last 5 years of reducing extreme poverty, we have lost this year because of COVID. The third big impact is really on the third real big impact is on the health pandemic also becoming now a hunger pandemic. Last year in 2019, we had about 135 million people who were at the level C stage of food insecurity amongst the 817 million people that go to bed hungry every day. And this year, because of COVID, we have doubled that number. So there is now about 260 million people who are at the level C stage of food insecurity, which means they cannot survive without external food assistance. The role of the World Food Program and other such institutions have become now central and crucial to solve for this issue. And no wonder the World Food Program was recognized with the Nobel Peace Prize this year for its effort in combating what was a health pandemic that migrated into being a hunger pandemic. The fourth is economies have been destroyed and shattered. We've had the largest degrowth in global economy, with this year's growth being at about -5% as far as the IMF's latest forecasts are concerned, compared to roughly 2.7 or 8% growth last year, 3.9% the prior year. And as one Federal Reserve president said, we have come down in this crisis in an escalator, but we will be getting back by climbing the stairs. So I do not see a V-shaped recovery. I see a slow, prolonged recovery. And before we get back to pre-COVID economic activity levels, it would be probably end of 22, probably beginning of 23. We've got now ballooning fiscal deficits. Last year, the global fiscal deficit averaged 3.9%. This year, it is estimated to end at 13.9%, a 10% increase in global fiscal deficit. The global debt to GDP ratios has gone up by 20 percentage points from something like 82% in 2019 to an expected exit this year of something like 102% debt to gross GDP. So that is the fourth major impact. Then we have had three major shocks as a result of COVID. We've had the demand shock, we've had the supply shock, and we've had the financial shock. In terms of demand shock for food and agriculture, particularly where there is out-of-home consumption or food service segment, demand has significantly eroded as a result of lockdowns and closure of restaurants and hotels and out-of-home consumption. Food staple consumption has held. Discretionary food, including cocoa and chocolate consumption, have had seen some demand erosion. We've had major supply side disruptions, particularly in terms of lockdowns, in terms of farmers not being able to sell their produce to a processing facility, whether it's in fresh fruit and vegetables, whether it's in livestock, whether it's in other products, logistics lockdowns, port lockdowns, which have all had massive supply chain side disruptions and impact. And finally, as a result of the demand shock and the supply side shock, in many countries, particularly in Africa, for example, in Nigeria, for many of the food staples, prices doubled as a result of a declining currency, as they had a double whammy impact of the oil crisis and the COVID crisis. And as a result, in local currency terms, some food prices had almost doubled. 150 million people in Africa have lost jobs. There is no wherewithal with the governments in these countries to provide a job support scheme or some kind of monetary support to help them navigate through this. And these are frontline daily wage earners. And if they do not earn a daily wage for a day, then they cannot feed their families. So that is a big crisis. And unlike the developed world, which has committed about $20 trillion of fiscal and monetary support to tide through this crisis, there isn't that ability in the emerging markets, particularly in the low-income countries, to be able to support such programs. So this is the first big issue. The second issue that I want to talk about is, as a result of this, the global sustainability challenges, which have now become existential threats for us. There are three major threats that confront us this century, and that is just accelerated post-COVID. The first is the climate emergency. The second is the collapse of nature and biodiversity. And the third is sharply rising social inequities, whether it is in the form of rising inequalities, income inequalities, wealth inequalities, whether it is systemic poverty, whether it is systemic discrimination, systemic racism. All of these three things together are very interlinked with interlocked causes, and we cannot try and address and solve for these three issues separately. Just a quick word on each of these three major global developmental challenges. The first one, in terms of climate emergency, we have a carbon budget of 572 gigatons from 2018 to 2050. We are emitting about 41 gigatons of greenhouse gases each year. We need to halve it by 2030 and get it to net zero by 2050. Based on the way we are delivering on our nationally determined contributions under the Paris Accord, there is zero chance or no chance at all for us to be able to restrict global warming within the 1.5 or 2 degrees centigrade that we are committed to do. And there's a world of a difference between achieving global warming 1.5 degrees and keeping it under 1.5 versus 2 degrees. It might be just half a degree apart, but the environmental consequences and the climate consequences are cataclysmic between 1.5 and 2 degrees centigrade. Secondly, in terms of the nature and biodiversity issues, we are losing species at an alarming rate. That is the invisible cost of nature. We are not able to see it, so we're not so clear about what that impact is. The cost of externalities in just producing food and livestock, in a study done by True Cost, was about $3 trillion annually. And this is the cost of producing the food, feed, and fiber that we all depend on. But there is externalities that we borrow from nature. And because Mother Nature's back office is not set up, it is not issuing us those invoices. We have seen in the cocoa supply chains in Côte d'Ivoire, between 1960 and today, we have lost 80% of the forests. We have lost roughly 1 billion hectares of forest in the last 40 years. We are losing between 28 and 30 million hectares of forest each year. We have lost 17% of our bee population. In every country, the population of insects, in terms of bats, in terms of birds, is coming down. We have lost about 25% of all our mangroves in the last, since 1980. We have lost about 70% of our coastal wetlands, about 60% of our inland wetlands already in the last 100 odd years. So we are losing species at an alarming rate. The boundary is 10 species for every million species that we own, but against that, we're losing about 1 million species as a result. I want to then address the key sustainability challenges in the cocoa value chain. The first and the foremost for me is, how do we get traceability, granular traceability for the journey of cocoa beans and the final product that we deliver to our customers, and the chocolates that they make and deliver to the consumers, or the other confectionery products. So how do we achieve granular traceability in a very fragmented supply chain with millions of smallholder farmers
growing cocoa in the many countries that cocoa is grown. That's one challenge. The second challenge is how do we make sure that the cocoa that we produce and supply is deforestation free, given the challenges that we have on the collapse of nature and biodiversity. The third challenge that we have is the smallholder farmers who grow the cocoa beans for us. Nearly 90% of the world's cocoa farmers are at or below the $1.90 monetary poverty line, right? 50% of the cocoa farmers are well below that $1.90 monetary poverty line. And for example, in the cocoa supply chains in Côte d'Ivoire, the average cocoa household income, farming household income, is $2,000 per farming household, cocoa farming household, whereas Fair Trade International has said that the living income that is required in Côte d'Ivoire for the cocoa farmer is $7,300. So it is less than a third of what the living income is. We cannot enjoy our confectionery products that we all love if the farmers who are producing it get a raw deal and do not get a fair share of that value. That's our second big challenge. Our third big challenge is how do we get to child labor free cocoa supply chains? And globally, we have now 260 million children involved in child labor. 2/3 of the child labor in the world is in agriculture. And in cocoa, we have a serious issue of child labor. How do we understand the underlying causes for deforestation, for child labor, for low farmer incomes? And how do we migrate into a vision where we can have cocoa supply chains that are climate positive, that are deforestation free, that are child labor free? And how do we get to that stage? So I think it is here where we need pre-competitive alliances, because a couple of actors doing good in transforming the cocoa supply chain into a sustainable future is not going to move the needle or really change anything. So I think the role of WCF, the role of the Cocoa and Forest Initiative, and all of these pre-competitive multi-stakeholder groups, we have to act. The sad part is it is easy for us to come together and have bold goals and ambitions for what we want to achieve in sustainability. But there is a massive action gap. So we had, as a globe, 194 countries agreed in 2010 that we will meet 20 goals between 2010 and 2020 in terms of the Biodiversity Convention. Against the 20 goals, we have completed the 10-year period, we have achieved 4 goals. We are 5 years into these SDGs, and we got another 10 years to go to achieve those SDGs. So 1/3 of the way through, and we are significantly behind the trajectory in achieving the 17 goals and the 149 targets. We have 196 countries that come together and signed the Paris Accord. As I said, there's no chance in hell that we will achieve it. So if we can achieve these miracles of people coming together and having these bold pronouncements and ambitions, but we had this massive action gap, what can we do to solve that problem? I want to suggest 5 things. The first is that we have to be the change that we see in others. Everyone in this conference, everybody at WCF, everyone in the cocoa supply chain, we have to be the change that we want to see in others. If you're not going to change individually, we are not going to be able to change anything at all. Secondly, each of us as actors in the supply chain, each of us as companies will need to change, make bold targets and set bold ambitions, disclose transparently how we are doing against those ambitions and those targets, good, bad, ugly, everything to be disclosed. Third, just 2 or 3 actors in the supply chain are not going to make a difference. And that is why the whole cocoa sector has to come together, because we have a collective accountability to transform and pivot the cocoa value chain from where it is today to a truly sustainable value chain in the future. The third is that research institutions and innovators and scientists have to come up with the next big breakthroughs where we can achieve more with less. And we have to work in partnership with them. Fifthly, civil society, NGOs, and companies have to form unusual and unnatural coalitions and collaborations. The NGO and civil society see companies as evil. The companies see them as troublemakers. We are not able to come together to solve a big issue, a big problem. We need to come together. And finally, government and policy makers have to come to the party. They have to insist on public disclosures of natural capital, social capital. They have to insist on multiple capital reporting. They have to have a carbon tax. Any resource that is free, we're going to use indiscriminately. And they have to make sure that there is advocacy for sustainable change across both the E piece of ESG as well as the S piece of ESG, because both the E and the S piece are mightily important for us. I don't want to blow our horn in terms of what Olam has done, but I'm just so incredibly proud of what Jerry and his team has done in all of these areas. And I would urge that in a spirit of pre-competitive alliance, as stakeholders who want to see change, we should come together, share our experiences, and average up all our standards in making sure that we can transform the supply chain. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Sunny, as always, you've given us an inspiring set of remarks that's grounded in real data and an understanding of the macroeconomic, microeconomic, and household level situation. I particularly take away and resonate some comments and reflections about the back office of nature is not sending us the invoices. There's a massive action gap. And then you laid out very concrete challenges for the industry, civil society, and governments to take up. I think this is a fantastic call to arms. And Carlos, we're so delighted that you were able to join us earlier than expected and that you had a chance to hear the private sector perspective on these issues. I think everyone knows Carlos Rodriguez, so it's an honor to be able to welcome him to his first COCO conference. Carlos was elected as the Chief Executive Officer and Chairperson of the Global Environment Facility in June 2020. And as all of you know, WCF and the COCO companies have a long-standing partnership and collaboration with Carlos that started with Naoko before him, and we look forward to the continued partnership under Carlos's leadership. As the former Costa Rican Environment and Energy Minister, Carlos was the global pioneer in the development of payment for environmental services and strategies for forest restoration, ocean conservation, and decarbonization. He's internationally recognized expert on environmental policy, multilateral environmental negotiations, and financing for nature conservation. During his 3 terms as minister, Costa Rica doubled the size of its forests, made its electric sector 100% clean and renewable, and consolidated a national park system that has positioned the Central American country as a prime ecotourism destination. 3 remarkable achievements which were due to Carlos's leadership. Since the 1992 UN Sustainable Development Summit in Rio, Carlos has participated in every multilateral environmental negotiations as an expert negotiator in UNFCCC, CBD, and UNCCD. And he's played a pivotal role in the creation and launch of the GEF and the Green Climate Fund. After his second tenure as minister, Carlos also worked as the vice president for global policy at Conservation International for 12 years. So he comes not only from the public sector, but also brings important civil society experience. Carlos, we are honored you can join us, and we turn the floor over to you for your reflections.
Well, thank you so much, Rick. It's an honor and pleasure not just to be in WCF, but also to talk after Sonny which gave us such a comprehensive, compelling remarks. Sonny has been supporting the GF, and his wisdom, experience, and guidance for us is incredibly important. And let me try to build and complement on what Sonny said. I'm 60 years old, and I haven't seen a crisis like this one in my whole life. Unfortunately, we tend to believe that a crisis is a moment in time that we will overcome. But this is not a crisis. This is a dramatic change for humans. And so it's not a crisis because a crisis is an impact that we need to deal with, and eventually we go back to some kind of normality. We will never go back to some kind of normality, or we shouldn't go back to any kind of normality. And this change that we will be confronted with is probably similar to other major changes that humankind has gone through. Probably the last biggest one was the Industrial Revolution. And this one should lead us into these fourth Industrial Revolution concepts and principles. But most importantly, it is based on the need that we need to recognize that humans has a broken relationship with nature. And if we don't put attention on the very important elements of values and principles, everything that we will try in terms of moving towards a new paradigm won't be able to achieve what we wanted. And yes, there's a broken relationship, and that broken relationship is the direct product of an economic system, this system that takes, makes, and wastes, that aims to unlimited growth without recognizing planetary boundaries. And Sonny expressed it so clear, the size and the level of the challenge that we're confronted. So this situation of the pandemic is letting us to understand not just the broken relationship with the human and nature, but also how fragile we humans are, not just because of the pandemic, but on many different global issues. And this pandemic will, is triggering a huge economic recession. That economic recession will generate a lot of social unrest, not just because of those who are going below the line of poverty once more, or those who never got above the line of poverty. This social unrest will be led by middle classes in Singapore, in Costa Rica, in France, in Ecuador, in the US, because the economic model hasn't been able to provide them a satisfactory life, quality, happiness. Those are key elements that we need to understand. And that social unrest will be joined eventually by the impacts of this biodiversity crisis that, as Sonny mentioned, it is quite invisible, but it will affect every single human in the planet, because it's not just the loss of biodiversity, it's that our footprint, the human footprint, is affecting the life supporting system of the planet. And yes, of course, climate change is around the corner. And I'm down here in Costa Rica. We had 2 hurricanes in the last 15 days. Nicaragua and Honduras, 2 very important cocoa producing countries, has been devastated by that. And this is, unusual. So we need to realize that we are entering an epoch we call the Anthropocene, where, pandemics, forest fires, huge weather events will be the normality, and we need to prepare ourselves. But I'm very optimistic that we can do the leap forwards if we can understand the need to change. So here, Rick, a couple of ideas on what the GF is thinking on being able to support countries and the global society to do transformational efforts. The GF has been doing very good in terms of understanding that it doesn't make any sense to use Northern taxpayers' money to support environmental action in the South if we just concentrate on the problem, not on the root case of the problem. And here's where the GF a few years ago began this very interesting, well-focused approach in system transformation. And since food production and food system is one of the main ways by which we contribute in biodiversity loss and climate change, the GF has been systematically investing in this. 80% of tropical deforestation is generated by food systems. And this approach has been extremely important. So how do we continue being able to focus and amplify and increase our impact with the same level of financing? And one of the things that I've been trying to do as I come into the GF is really understand, I understand very well the size of the problem, but I don't know the size of the muscle that the GF does us in the context of our responsibilities in reverting climate change and protecting nature. So I've been doing a lot of analysis from the financial point of view, from the environmental impact point of view, and the GF has a very positive impact, but it's not much, no more than 1 or 2% of what all countries should be doing in order to be on track with the Paris Agreement and the CBD. So how do we upscale our impact? Well, two things are key and very important, and Sonny talk about them. One very important for me is policy coherence. We cannot be able to achieve any sustainability goal, target, or standards if we still have countries with high policy incoherence. We invest 150 times more in activities that generates deforestation than what we invest in forest conservation. So how do we generate that? The GF is investing millions and millions of dollars in countries that keep on having extremely high levels of deforestation, a lot of pollution, and we are on track of having more plastic than fish in the water. So policy coherence is not just that they don't have the wisdom or the vision. It is the end product of a failed institutional framework in the public sectors. When we see governments, how they have structured their agencies, they work on sectors, they work on silos, and they don't complement. Even though we need to move toward landscape integrated institutional frameworks, we still work on silos. So, we got a Ministry of Energy and Mines, a Ministry of Agriculture, a Ministry of Forests, a Ministry of Environment, all doing similar things or different things in the same landscape with the same stakeholders. The end result is a big mess. The end result is deforestation. The end result is contribution to climate change. The end result is losing all possibilities to be more resilient to pandemic and climate change. So my point here is that the policy incoherence that we see, which is, that sectoral vision, the big confrontation, Rick, we will never achieve sustainability in the cocoa sector if we don't have a understanding within Ministries of Agriculture and Ministries of Environment. And let me pause here, because this is important. I've been 3 times Minister of Environment in Costa Rica. I know the mindset of Ministries of Agriculture, and we got a big issue here. So here is where initiatives like the Cocoa Forest Initiative is fabulous and great, because this can be the glue that can bring together under a common understanding of how we can integrate it in an integrated fashion, manage landscapes within agriculture and environment, because they don't carry along very good. As a matter of fact, many ministers of environment complain that their biggest threat and their biggest politically bullying come from ministers from agriculture, which tend to believe that ministers of environment are the ones who generate conservation, meaning no human development, no economic growth. And they tend to believe that ministries of agriculture are the only ones who can generate progress, prosperity, jobs, and income. So we need to ask ourselves, what is the difference between ministries of environment and agriculture? That's a very important question that we need to ask ourselves, because the classic impression is that one does conservation and the other does production, and that is wrong. Both do production. For me, the only difference is that ministries of environment work with wild biodiversity, and ministries of agriculture work with domesticated biodiversity in the same landscapes. So eventually, down the road, we don't need a Ministry of Agriculture and Ministry of Environment. We need one agency that works at the landscape level avoiding the silo effects and narrowing down those visions. The same thing with energy and mines. We need to, we cannot continue dividing agency within those who manage renewable and non-renewable natural resources. I used to be the Minister of Environment and Energy and Mines in Costa Rica. Having energy and environment in Costa Rica gave us the institutional conditions to be what you just mentioned, Rick, 100% renewable energy. And now we have a decarbonization plan where we aim to be zero emission by 2050, generating, you know, a few 100,000 green jobs out of the process. We were able to do that because we had the right institutional framework. So my point here, Rick, is we'll never achieve any sustainability standard. We keep on thinking that with the same institutional framework that has created the problem that today we want to solve, we will achieve that. We need to be creative and be able to recognize that there is not only, as Sonny said, a market failure, there's also a huge institutional failure in the public sector that we need to deal with. And my final last point is the fact that many countries tend to believe that the way they can solve this environmental related issue is by putting more pressure to the north to supply more financial resources. And I work in a multilateral agency that channels resources from the north to the south. We've been very successful in the last 30 years, but we will never move the needle into the scale that we needed if we don't understand that countries should mobilize domestic resources, public expenditures way more efficiently than they are doing today. Today, most developing countries doesn't know how much money they are investing in nature conservation because there is not a budget item that says biodiversity conservation. If you don't know how much you are investing, your investment won't be as efficient as they can probably be. So you need to hire, Rick, you need to hire like an archaeologist to go and dig into the Ministry of Finance in those public budgets to really understand how much the country is investing in biodiversity conservation. Because you only account to what the Ministry of Environment is doing. You don't account on cocoa and forest or zero emission cocoa production as a investment in biodiversity because it is done by the Ministry of Agriculture. As you do the biodiversity expenditure review, you do the other exercise, which is your financial needs at the country level. Countries need to do their financial need to implement the Paris Accord, the CBD, the land degradation, and as you do both things, you will have an idea of the gap. The gap can be narrow by generating more policy coherence. The gap can be narrow by putting a tax on fossil fuels. And Sonny mentioned the tax on fossil fuels. And I promise I finish with this one because this is very important in the context of WCF. Costa Rica recognized that many years ago there was a market failure because those who own forests, and in Costa Rica, forests and cocoa farms are basically the same thing. In 1980, I worked doing the first forest map in Costa Rica. There were no satellite images back then, only aerial pictures. And I saw a lot of aerial pictures and I said, whoa, those are very interesting forests. And they told me, no, those are not forests, those are cocoa farms. And I didn't believe that. I had to go to the site and realize that, yes, you got a primary forest full of, cocoa. So we put a tax on carbon on fossil fuels 1997 to deal with a market failure, which is if you own a forest or a agroforestry system like cocoa, you generate positive externalities by offsetting carbon, you should be paid for that. The moment we designed that mechanism, Costa Rica began reverting the rate of deforestation. We increased agroforestry activities. We narrowed down the gap in terms of vision within agriculture and environment agencies. And now we've been able to double the size of our forests while the economy tripled in that same period. And this is what I call the tropical carbon tax. It's it's very different to the northern tax, which has a different rationale. We can mobilize resources to do payments for carbon offset on the very different land uses. And cocoa is in a unique situation to be able to do that. So the GF will be looking, how do we continue, supporting the cocoa forest initiative and bringing these elements of, innovative financial mechanism. REDD+ has been, to be frank, quite a failure at the global level. That is why payment for environmental services, carbon taxes at the local level can be a good idea. And yes, probably countries will say, we are very poor, our economy is very small to put a tax on carbon. That is not doing the proper homework. You just put a 1% tax on fossil fuels. It generates immediately a few $1 million. As a matter of fact, it's a good way by which you can mobilize resources from the higher income segment of society to those who live in the frontier areas. You'll be translating wealth as you create a environmentally related mechanism. Cocoa is in the center of agroforestry and in a great possibility to design the carbon offsetting programs at the national level. As we wish that there's an agreement on Article 6 on UNFCCC, where eventually global carbon markets can kick in. My point here, we shouldn't wait and continue to see land use change for Article 6 of an agreement on Article 6 and that future magical carbon forest market to kick in. We need to work at the domestic level. Agroforestry systems are in the center of this, putting a small tax on fossil fuels or accessing the voluntary carbon market, and the GF is all very much interested to support this, can be great.
Carlos, this is fantastic.
Doing it with agroforestry will bring, and I finish here, a PES on carbon, on agroforestry will be the way by which you can glue down agriculture and environment agencies and once and for all stop that political confrontation in terms of vision. Thank you so much, Rick.
Carlos, what an inspiring set of messages that perfectly complements what we heard from Sunny. You focused on the institutional failures that exist in addition to the market failures, and your comments about the tensions between ministries of agriculture and environment is what we live every day. And the ideas that you bring for more efficient public expenditure reviews, looking at alternative financial instruments, is exactly the new kind of thinking that we need to accelerate progress. We've had 150 people watching this session, and I'm sure all of them would have loved to have asked questions and continue this important dialogue. Unfortunately, we've got another panel that starts in 1 minute that is building on this discussion. It's about what the European Union is going to be doing to promote a sustainable policy dialogue. And we've got the European Commissioner for International Partnerships, the European Parliament Vice President, and other important public and private partners to build on the messages that we've heard from Sunny and Carlos. So heartfelt thanks, Sunny and Carlos. My only request is we want to keep the discussion going with you two. You're putting on the table the challenges and the new ideas that the industry needs to hear to make progress. Thank you so much and take good care.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you.